They turned her away before the snow even touched the ground, and that should have been the end of it. But Elias Whitaker chose differently, and by sunrise, nothing on his land would belong to him alone ever again. Now before we go on, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your town or state below. And if you believe a man can change his fate without ever raising a gun, stay with me, because this one rides quiet. The wind that night came down hard from the north, sharp enough to cut through wool and bone. And Elias stood outside his cabin with his coat pulled tight, watching the last light fade behind a line of frozen hills. His ranch stretched out for near 40 acres, dry, quiet, forgotten, just the way he'd kept it for years. No neighbors, no visitors, no trouble, only cattle, wood, and the kind of silence a man learns to live with when the world has already passed him by. Inside that cabin sat one small stack of firewood, barely enough to last 2 nights if he rationed it. Right, and Elias knew exactly how long each log had to burn, because out here, fire wasn't comfort. It was survival measured in hours, not warmth. And then he saw her, just a shadow at first, barely moving along the fence line like something the wind had pushed there and forgotten. He didn't reach for his rifle, didn't call out, just watched, the way a man does when he's learned that most things that come out of the dark don't stay long. But she didn't leave. She stumbled once, caught herself. Then again, slower this time. And that's when he noticed the way she held her arms close, not from fear, but from cold that had already settled too deep. Apache, he could tell from the patterns in what little fabric the wind hadn't torn loose. And that alone was enough reason for most men within 50 miles to shut their doors and look the other way. The town had done it just hours before, sent her back into the storm like she carried something dangerous. But Elias wasn't most men. He stepped forward just enough for the lantern light to reach her face, pale under dust, eyes steady but fading, and for a long second, neither of them spoke. The wind filled that silence, rattling the loose boards of the fence, whispering through the dry grass, reminding him exactly what it would cost. Inside that cabin sat the last of his firewood, the last of his warmth, the thin line between making it through the week or not. He could close the door, turn his back, pretend he never saw her, and no one would question it. No one ever questioned anything Elias Whitaker did, because no one came close enough to care. But then she took one more step and her knees nearly gave out beneath her, and something in that quiet collapse broke the stillness he'd been living in for too long. He opened the door, slow, deliberate, not a word spoken, just a gesture, just enough space for her to step inside. And when she did, the cold followed her in, heavy, biting, clinging to the walls like it belonged there now. Elias looked once at the fire pit, then at the small stack of wood beside it, counted without thinking, 1, 2, 3 nights if he was careful, maybe less if the wind didn't let up. His hand hovered over the first log, then stopped, just for a second, the kind of second that decides a man's future. Then he dropped it into the fire, and another, until the flames rose higher than they had in weeks, filling the cabin with heat he knew he couldn't afford. And still, he didn't say a word. The fire burned louder than it should have for a cabin that small, each crack of the wood echoing like a quiet warning Elias chose to ignore. The heat filled the space slowly, pushing back the cold that had settled deep into the walls. And for the first time in days, maybe weeks, the air did not bite his lungs when he breathed. The woman sat near the fire but not too close, her movements careful, measured, like someone who understood the weight of taking more than she was given. Her eyes stayed on the flames, not on him, and that told Elias more than words ever could. She was not here to ask, not here to take. She was here because she had nowhere left to go, and that kind of truth did not need explaining. He moved across the cabin and set a tin cup near her, filled with water he had melted from snow just hours earlier. It was not much, nothing about this place ever was, but she accepted it with both hands, a small nod, quiet respect, the kind men rarely noticed until it was gone. The wind outside pressed harder against the cabin, rattling the boards, slipping through cracks that had never mattered before tonight. But now every sound felt sharper, louder, as if the world itself was reminding him of what he had given away. Elias pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and sat across from her, not too close, not too far, just enough to watch the fire and keep count without making it obvious. One log already half gone, another beginning to catch, The flames climbed higher, stronger than they had any right to be, and still he said nothing. Silence was easier than questions, easier than answers. Time moved slow in that cabin, measured only by the way the fire shifted and settled, by the way the woman's breathing steadied, no longer shallow, no longer chasing. Something it could not hold. At one point she reached into the folds of her clothing and pulled out something small, something wrapped tight in worn leather. She hesitated, just for a moment, then placed it gently on the table between them, not offering it, not explaining it, just leaving it there like a truth that would make sense later. Elias glanced at it, but did not touch it. Not yet. Some things carried weight you could feel before you ever laid a hand on them. And this was one of those things. The hours passed without words. The fire burned lower, then rose again as another log gave itself to the flames. Each one a quiet trade. Warmth now for uncertainty later. Elias knew exactly what he was doing, and more importantly, what it would cost him when the sun came up, but he did not stop. Sometime deep into the night, the woman shifted, her eyes lifting from the fire for the first time, meeting his. There was no fear there now, no panic, just something steadier, something that felt older than either of them. She spoke then, her voice low, careful, carrying an accent shaped by distance and memory. You did not have to do this. Elias held her gaze for a moment, then looked back to the fire, his answer simple, almost lost. In the sound of the burning wood. I know. And that was all. No explanation, no reason, just truth laid down between them like the fire itself. She studied him for a second longer, then gave the smallest nod, as if something unspoken had been understood. Outside, the storm began to ease, not gone, but quieter, the kind of quiet that comes before something changes. Elias leaned back slightly, feeling the warmth fade already as the last of the logs began to break apart into glowing embers. He could feel the cold waiting just beyond the walls, patient, certain, knowing it would have its turn again soon. But for now, the fire held, and so did the silence. And somewhere between those two things, something had shifted in a way Elias could not yet name. By the time the last ember folded into ash, the cabin had gone quiet in a way Elias had not felt in years. Not empty, not lonely, just still. The kind of stillness that comes after something has already been decided. He must have drifted, without knowing, because when his eyes opened again, the light had changed, pale gray slipping through the cracks in the wood. Morning had come, and with it, the cold returned, not rushing, not harsh, but steady, reclaiming what the fire had held back through the night. Elias sat up slowly, his joints stiff, his breath visible again in the air, and for a moment he did not remember why the fire pit was empty, why the stack of wood beside it had vanished completely. Then he saw the open door, just a few inches wide, the wind moving it gently, back and forth, like someone had left without wanting to be heard. He stood, pulling his coat tight, and stepped across the cabin, his boots quiet against the worn floorboards. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the land stretched out in white and silence. Every fence line softened, every track erased, except for one, a single line of footprints leading away from the cabin, light, steady, deliberate. She had left before sunrise, not waiting, not asking, just gone. Elias followed the prints a few steps, then stopped, not because he could not continue, but because he understood enough to know there was no point. Whatever path she walked did not belong to him, and whatever he had given was not meant to be followed. He turned back toward the cabin, already feeling the cold settling deeper now, the kind that does not leave easy. Inside, the air felt thinner without the fire, the silence sharper, but something else caught his eye. The small leather bundle she had placed on the table the night before, still there, untouched, exactly where she had left it. Elias approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if he moved too fast. His fingers hovered above it for a moment before finally lifting it from the wood. It was lighter than he expected, but not empty, never empty. He unwrapped the worn leather carefully, revealing a beaded pendant beneath, small, handcrafted, the kind of work that takes time and patience, the kind that carries meaning beyond what it looks like. The beads caught the morning light in quiet colors, earth tones, sky tones, something older than the land itself. Elias turned it over in his hand, studying the pattern, not understanding it, but feeling the weight of it settle into his palm. This was not payment, not trade. It was something else, something given with intention, something he had not asked for, and that made it heavier than anything he had ever carried. He closed his fingers around it slowly, then slipped it into his coat pocket without another thought. Outside, the world remained still, but not empty. Not anymore. Elias stepped out onto the porch again, his eyes scanning the horizon the way they always did, habit more than purpose. But this time, something was different. Far in the distance, where the land dipped just beyond the far fence, there was movement, faint at first, almost easy to miss. A line of shapes against the pale sky, one becoming two becoming more. Elias narrowed his eyes slightly, his breath slowing as he focused. Riders, too far to make out details, but too many to ignore. They moved steady, not rushed, not scattered, like they knew exactly where they were going, like they had been coming long. Before he ever saw them, Elias did not move, did not reach for anything, just stood there, watching, the pendant in his pocket suddenly feeling heavier than before. The wind carried a low sound across the open land, not voices, not yet, just the rhythm of something approaching, something that did not belong to the silence he had lived in for so long. And for the first time since the fire went out, Elias felt something shift in his chest, not fear, not quite, but the understanding that whatever was coming over that ridge was not here by accident, and whatever it meant, it had already begun long before this morning ever arrived. The riders did not slow as they crossed the ridge, and that was the first thing Elias noticed, not their numbers, not the way they moved, but the certainty in it, like they were not searching, not wandering, but arriving. He stood on the porch with his hands loose at his sides, the cold pressing through his coat as the distance between them closed yard by yard. The land stretched wide around him, nearly 40 acres of open ground with nowhere to hide and nothing to defend but silence. And still, he did not step back. The shapes grew clearer with each passing second, horses strong and steady, riders upright, wrapped in patterns that carried meaning he could not read but could not ignore. Apache. There was no mistaking it now. One rider became 5, 5 became 20, and behind them more followed, not rushed, not scattered, but aligned in a way that spoke of purpose rather than threat. Elias felt the weight in his pocket again, the small pendant pressing against his chest like it had something to say before the men ever did. He let his breath out slowly, watching it fade into the air as the first of the riders reached his fence line. None of them crossed it. Not yet. They stopped just short, forming a quiet line that stretched farther than he could count at a glance. No one reached for a weapon. No one called out. The only sound was the soft shift of horses settling into place, leather creaking, breath visible in the cold morning air. Elias stepped down from the porch, one boot at a time, the wood beneath him creaking in protest, but the riders did not react. They watched, not with hostility, not with welcome, just with presence, the kind that does not need to prove itself. He walked forward a few paces, stopping just inside his own fence line, close enough to see their faces now, painted in ways that told stories he had never been taught. Eyes steady, focused, but not hard, not the way men looked when they came to take something. And that was when he realized what unsettled him most. There was no urgency here, no tension waiting to snap, just a quiet patience, as if whatever needed to happen would happen without force. One of the riders moved then, not quickly, not to lead, but simply forward, his horse stepping with care until he stood a few yards from Elias, older than the others, his presence heavier without needing to show it. He looked at Elias for a long moment, not speaking, not demanding, just measuring something that could not be seen with the eyes alone. Elias met that gaze without flinching, not out of courage, but because there was nothing left in him that knew how to step away anymore. The wind moved between them, carrying the faint scent of ash from the cabin behind him, a reminder of what had already been given, and for a second, no one moved. Then the older man's eyes shifted, just slightly, toward Elias's coat, toward the place where the pendant rested beneath the fabric, and something passed between them in that glance, something quiet but certain. The man nodded once, small, deliberate, and that was all. No words, no explanation. He turned his horse to the side, and that single movement broke the stillness, not into chaos, not into noise, but into motion. The riders began to spread out, not rushing, not pressing inward, but moving along the edges of the land, following the fence lines, stepping through open spaces. With care, some dismounted, placing hands on the ground as if greeting it. Others began marking posts, adjusting what had already been there without removing it. Elias stood where he was, watching as his land changed without being taken, as presence replaced emptiness without force. No one asked him for permission, and yet nothing about it felt like it had been stolen. The cold still lingered in the air, but it no longer felt like the only thing that filled the space. Elias reached into his coat slowly, his fingers closing around the pendant again, and for the first time since the riders appeared, he understood one thing clearly. Whatever had begun the moment he fed that fire was not something that would end with the morning, and whatever this was becoming, it was no longer his to face alone. They moved across his land like they had always known it, not fast, not careless, but with a kind of quiet familiarity that made Elias feel like the stranger on his own ground. He turned slowly, watching as two men knelt near the old fence post by the east ridge, not tearing it down, not claiming it, just reinforcing it, straightening what time and wind had bent. Another group walked toward the dry creek bed where the soil had long since cracked and given up. They pressed their hands into the earth as if listening, as if the land itself had something to say and they were patient enough to hear it. Elias stayed where he was for a moment longer, then stepped forward, not toward them, but into his own field, boots pressing into the thin layer of frost, each step grounding him in something that felt both familiar and changed. He had spent years keeping people away from this place, building silence like a wall no one could cross. And now that wall had not been broken, it had simply been walked through, and no one had asked permission, yet no one had disrespected it either. That was what unsettled him most, the absence of force, the absence of demand. One of the younger men passed by him carrying a bundle of wood, real wood, dry, cut clean, enough to burn long and steady. Elias's eyes followed it without meaning to. The man did not stop, did not offer it, just placed it near the cabin door like it belonged there, like it had always been part of the place. Elias exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest heavier than before. The trade was not spoken, not measured, but it was there, clear as the ground beneath his feet. He had given warmth without expectation, and now warmth had returned without request. Only it was not just warmth. It was presence, protection, something larger than anything he had ever allowed himself to imagine. The older rider dismounted near the center of the land, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He walked a few steps, then stopped, looking out across the acres as if seeing something Elias never had. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, not loud enough to carry far, but enough for Elias to hear. This land does not stand alone. The words settled into the air without weight, without pressure, and yet they changed the space between them more than any raised voice ever could. Elias did not answer right away, not because he did not understand, but because he was still learning how to stand inside what those words meant. He looked out across the field, at the men moving, at the small changes already taking shape, a repaired fence, a marked boundary, a stack of wood where there had been none. And for the first time, the land did not feel empty. It did not feel quiet in the way it once had. It felt held, not owned, not taken, just held. Elias reached into his coat again, pulling out the pendant, the beads catching the pale sunlight as he turned it in his fingers. He stepped forward then, closing the distance between himself and the older man by a few yards, just enough to be heard without raising his voice. "She left this," he said simply, holding the pendant out slightly, not offering it back, just showing it. The older man looked at it for a moment, then back at Elias, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not recognition, but something closer to certainty. He nodded once, slower this time. "She does not leave what is not meant to stay." Elias let that sit in the silence that followed, the wind moving lightly across the open land, carrying the faint sound of movement, of life, of something that had not been here before. And as he stood there, between what he had been and what this place was becoming, Elias Whitaker understood something he had not known the night before, that sometimes a man gives away the last thing he has, not realizing it was never meant to be his alone in the first place. The sun climbed higher, but the cold did not leave. It only softened at the edges, settling into the ground like something that had learned patience. and Elias moved through his own land as if seeing it for the first time, not because it had changed in shape, but because it no longer carried the same silence. There were sounds now, low, steady, the kind that did not disturb but filled the spaces between thought, boots against frost, hands working wood, quiet voices carried just far enough to remind him he was not alone. He passed the fence line where he had spent weeks repairing a broken section the year before. Now it stood straighter than he had ever managed, reinforced not with force but with care, the wood set deeper, the line held stronger, and no one had asked him how it should be done. They had simply known, or perhaps they had listened in a way he never had. Near the creek bed, he saw two figures placing stones along the edge, not building, not blocking, just guiding the flow, preparing for water that had not yet returned, as if they trusted it would. Elias stopped there for a moment, watching the way their hands moved, slow, certain, and he realized something that settled heavier than the pendant in his pocket. They were not fixing his land, they were remembering it, bringing it back to something it had been before he ever arrived, before fences, before lines drawn by men who thought ownership meant control. He walked back toward the cabin, the stack of firewood now resting beside the door, larger than anything he had gathered in months, each piece cut clean, measured, enough to last not just days but weeks, maybe longer. He reached down and touched one of the logs, the surface smooth, dry, ready to burn, and for a brief second, he hesitated, not out of doubt, but because he understood now that this was not his in the way he had once believed anything could be. It was given, not owned, shared, not kept. He straightened and stepped back, leaving it untouched. The cabin door creaked open as he pushed it with his hand. The inside still carried the faint scent of smoke from the night before, but it was different now, lighter, as if the space itself had shifted. He stepped inside, glancing at the empty fire pit, then at the chair where she had sat, the memory of it still fresh, still close. He moved to the table and placed the pendant there for a moment, just looking at it, letting the quiet settle around him again. But this time the quiet did not press in, it rested like something that knew it would not be alone for long. Outside, a new sound rose, not loud, not urgent, just different. Elias stepped back out onto the porch, his eyes following the movement toward the far edge of the land. More figures had arrived, not riders this time, but families, women, children, carrying bundles, moving with the same steady purpose, not invading, not claiming, just joining. The land began to fill not with noise, but with life, small fires being built at a distance, smoke rising in thin lines that did not crowd the sky, paths forming where there had been none, not cutting through the land but moving with it. Elias stood there, his hands resting at his sides, watching as the space he had kept empty for so long found its own rhythm without asking him how. And for a moment, a thought crossed his mind, quiet but sharp. This was more than he had expected, more than he had planned for, more than one man alone could ever hold. He felt it then, not fear, not resistance, but the weight of change settling in, asking something of him he had not been asked in years, to stay, not to endure, but to belong. And as he stood there, the wind softer now, carrying the scent of wood and earth instead of only cold, Elias Whitaker realized that the hardest part was not giving away what he had. It was learning how to live in what had been given back. By midday, the land no longer looked like something waiting to be used. It looked like something already alive, and Elias found himself walking slower, not out of caution, but because there was more to notice now, more to understand. Paths had begun to form where the grass bent gently under repeated steps, not carved, not forced, just suggested by movement, a rhythm settling into place. He passed a small group near the southern edge where the ground dipped slightly. They were setting posts, not fencing anything in, but marking a boundary that followed the curve of the land instead of cutting across it. And that was when Elias realized the difference. Everything they did seemed to follow something older than ownership, something that did not belong to any one man. He kept walking until he reached the far side of his property, or what he had always called his property. The fence there had been leaning for years, a weak line that barely held against wind. Now it stood reinforced, but not replaced. The old was still there, strengthened instead of removed, like it had been given a second life rather than discarded. Elias rested his hand on the top rail, feeling the rough grain beneath his palm, and for the first time, he did not think about fixing it, did not calculate the cost, did not measure the effort. He simply stood there, letting the moment pass without trying to control it. Behind him, the quiet activity continued, low voices, steady hands. Children moving between the spaces without fear, without hesitation, as if they had always known this place. And perhaps in some way, they had. A young boy ran past him then, not stopping, not asking permission, just moving with purpose toward one of the small fires being built near the center of the land. Elias watched him go, expecting at least a glance back, some acknowledgement, but it did not come, and strangely, it did not feel like disrespect. It felt like trust, like the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real. He turned back toward the cabin, his steps slower now, more deliberate, and as he walked, he began to notice the spaces between things, not just what had been added, but what had been left untouched. The open field still stretched wide, the sky still clear above it, nothing crowded, nothing taken over, everything placed with care, like the land itself had a say in where each piece belonged. When he reached the porch, he paused, looking at the stack of firewood again, larger now than it had been that morning. Someone had added more without him seeing, without announcing it, just quietly building on what had already been given. Elias stepped up onto the porch and leaned against the post, his eyes drifting across the land, following the movement, the small changes, the life that had settled in without breaking anything that had come before. And for a moment, he felt something unfamiliar, not discomfort, not resistance, but a question, one he had not asked himself in years. What does a man do when the thing he has protected the most is no longer something he needs to protect alone? The thought lingered as he reached into his coat and pulled out the pendant again, the beads warm now from his body heat, no longer cold, no longer foreign. He turned it slowly in his fingers, the pattern still unreadable, but no longer distant. And as he stood there, watching the land breathe in a way it never had before, Elias Whitaker understood something that did not come all at once, but settled in piece by piece, that what had arrived here was not taking his place, it was making space for him, and whether he stepped into it or not was the only choice left that still belonged to him. The light shifted again as the afternoon stretched long across the land, shadows growing softer instead of sharper, and Elias remained on the porch, longer than he realized, not watching for danger, not counting what had changed, just letting his eyes move without needing to understand everything they saw. The fires now burned steady in different corners of the land, not large, not wasteful, just enough to hold warmth in quiet places, thin trails of smoke rising straight into the sky like signals that did not need to be read. And somewhere between those fires, life continued to settle in, not rushed, not claimed, just present. Elias stepped down from the porch again, slower this time, his boots finding the ground with a kind of familiarity that felt different now, like the land recognized him in a way it had not before. He walked toward the nearest fire, where a small group had gathered, not speaking much, just tending to what was there. One of them looked up as he approached, not surprised, not guarded, just aware, and gave a slight nod before returning to his work. Elias stopped a few feet away, close enough to feel the warmth, but not close enough to interrupt it. He stood there for a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out the pendant once more, the beads catching the light in a way that felt almost alive. He held it loosely in his hand. Then after a brief pause, he stepped forward and placed it gently on a flat stone near the fire, not giving it away, not returning it, just setting it where it could be seen, where it could belong to the space instead of to him alone. No one spoke, but one of the older women glanced at it, her eyes softening in a way that carried more meaning than any words could have. She adjusted a piece of wood in the fire, letting the flame rise just slightly, and Elias understood without being told. Some things were not meant to be held onto. Some things were meant to be placed back into the world that gave them meaning. He stepped back slowly, his hands empty now, but not lighter, just different. And as he turned, he noticed movement near the far side of the cabin, a familiar figure stepping into view. Iana stood there, no longer weakened by the cold, her posture steady, her presence quiet but certain. She had returned without announcement, without sound, as if she had never truly left. Elias did not move toward her right away, and she did not move toward him, The distance between them held something that did not need to be crossed quickly. She looked at him for a moment, then toward the land, taking in the fires, the movement, the life that had grown from a single night. And when her gaze returned to him, there was something there that had not been there before, not gratitude, not obligation, but recognition, the kind that does not need to be earned twice. She spoke then, her voice calm, steady. The land remembers who keeps it warm. Elias let those words settle, not rushing to answer, not needing to question them, because somewhere deep inside, he already understood. He had not saved her, not in the way stories are told. He had simply made a choice, and that choice had moved through the world in ways he could not see until now. Iana stepped closer then, just enough to stand within the same space without breaking it, her eyes shifting briefly toward the fire where the pendant rested, then back to him. "You did not lose anything," she said quietly. Elias looked out across the land again, at the fires, the people, the quiet order that had taken root without force. And for the first time, he did not see something that had been taken from him. He saw something that had been shared into existence. And as the wind moved gently across the open field, carrying warmth instead of only cold, Elias Whitaker realized that what he had once called his land had never truly been smaller than this. It had only ever been waiting for him to see it. That way evening came without asking, the sky stretching wide above the land as the last of the light settled into long shadows that moved gently across the ground. And Elias stood where he had been for what felt like hours, though time had lost its shape somewhere between the fire he lit the night before and the life now breathing across every acre around him. The air carried a different weight now, not heavy, not cold, just full, the kind of fullness that does not demand attention but makes itself known in quiet ways. The fires burned low but steady, each one held by careful hands that knew exactly how much was needed and nothing more. Voices moved through the space in soft patterns, never rising, never breaking the calm that had taken root. And Elias found himself walking again, not with purpose, not toward anything in particular, just moving through the land as if learning it all over again. He passed the creek where the stones had been set earlier, and already the shape of it looked different, not fixed, not forced, just guided, like something had been reminded of its path instead of told where to go. He continued on, his boots pressing into the earth that no longer felt empty beneath him. And as he walked, he noticed something he had not seen before, small markers placed at the edges of certain spaces, not fences, not barriers, just signs, quiet and deliberate, marking where one thing ended and another began, not to divide, but to respect. And that was when it settled fully in his chest. This place had not been taken from him. It had been returned to something larger than what he had made of it alone. He stopped near the center of the land where one of the fires burned a little brighter than the others, the stone where he had placed the pendant now warmed by the steady flame beside it. And for a moment, he simply stood there, looking at it, not reaching for it, not needing to, because it no longer felt like something he had to carry. It belonged where it was, part of something that did not begin or end with him. Behind him, he heard footsteps, soft, measured, and he did not turn right away. He already knew who it was. Iana stepped beside him, her presence quiet but certain, the kind that did not interrupt but completed the space around it. They stood there together without speaking, both looking toward the fire, toward the land, toward everything that had come from a single choice made in silence. And after a while, Elias spoke, his voice low, steady, almost lost in the evening air. "I thought I was losing it." Iana did not look at him, her gaze still resting on the fire. "You cannot lose what was never meant to belong to only one." The words settled without resistance, without question, and Elias nodded slightly. Not because he needed to agree, but because he understood, truly understood. For the first time, the wind moved through the land again, softer now, carrying the scent of wood smoke and earth that had begun to breathe again. And as the last light faded from the sky, Elias Whitaker stood in the center of what he had once called his land and felt no need to claim it, no need to guard it, no need to stand alone against it. Because out here, under a sky that did not belong to anyone, surrounded by people who had asked for nothing and given everything back, he finally understood that some things are not owned, not kept, not held. They are shared. And in that sharing, They become something no man could ever build by himself. And for the first time in years, Elias did not listen for the silence. He listened for the life within it, and he did not turn away.